Lieutenant Maria Hayes stood at the observation window of the human settlement on Zephyra, watching the alien sky shift from violet to deep crimson as the sun descended below the Crystal Mountains. She had been stationed on this strange world for exactly 3 years, 2 months, and 17 days. Not that she was counting or anything, but certain dates had become important to her in ways she never expected. The settlement behind her buzzed with the sound of urgent activity. Scientists were packing equipment, soldiers were loading weapons, and administrators were downloading crucial data from the main computers. Everyone was preparing for something that Maria still could not fully believe was happening. The message had arrived 6 hours ago through official military channels. Commander Blake of the Human Space Command had made the announcement herself, her face grave and tired on the video feed. Humans had to leave Zephyr immediately. The Valian government, specifically a powerful faction led by Warlord Kess, had decided that human presence on their world was too much of a risk to their civilization. The evacuation order was absolute, no exceptions, no negotiations. Every human had to board the transport ships within 24 hours or face the consequences. Maria had listened to the announcement along with everyone else in the settlement auditorium. She had nodded along as the emergency protocols were explained. She had even helped her fellow officers prepare their personal belongings for the evacuation. But deep inside her heart, something was pulling her in a completely different direction. The conflict between duty and personal loyalty was tearing her apart from the inside. The reason for her internal struggle was someone she had never expected to meet on this alien world. Her name was Zinnia, and she was the princess of the Valian royal house. They had first encountered each other 3 years ago at a formal diplomatic event. Maria had been assigned to protect the human ambassador, and Zinnia had been there representing her government at the ceremony. Something had clicked between them from that very first moment. It was not romantic love in the traditional sense, but it was something deeper and more meaningful. It was a connection that transcended species, language, and cultural boundaries. Over the following 3 years, they had spent countless hours together whenever protocol allowed it. They would meet in the gardens of the royal palace where exotic flowers bloomed in impossible colors. Xenia would teach Maria words in her native language, and Maria would share stories about Earth and human history. They would sit for hours under the strange stars of Zephyra, talking about everything and nothing. Maria had learned that Xenia loved music, that she was terrified of deep water, and that she secretly disagreed with many of her government's policies. In return, Xenia had learned that Maria came from a small town, that she joined the military to escape a painful past, and that she had always felt like an outsider among her own people. Their friendship had grown so strong that it had started to worry the Valian government. Maria had noticed it in subtle ways at first. The number of official events where she was invited had decreased. The security around Xenia had increased, and then, just 3 weeks ago, Xenia had shared a terrible secret with Maria during one of their secret meetings in the palace gardens. Warlord Kess had summoned her to his chambers and given her an ultimatum. She had to publicly denounce her friendship with humans, or she would face serious consequences. He believed that her connection to Maria had made her weak and vulnerable. He saw it as a threat to the stability of the kingdom. Xenia had refused. She had looked directly into Warlord Kess's eyes and told him that she would not abandon her friend for political convenience. Her refusal had shocked everyone, including the warlord himself. Nobody in the royal house had ever dared to speak to him that way. But Xenia was strong and she had the courage of her convictions. The problem was that this act of defiance had put her in real danger. Warlord Kess had begun spreading rumors that she was unfit to be princess. He had started plotting to remove her from the line of succession. Now, with the evacuation order in place, Maria understood what Warlord Kess was really doing. He was using the evacuation as an opportunity to eliminate his enemies. Once all humans were gone, he could move against Xenia without any complications. He could claim that she was a threat to Valian security, and no one would question him because there would be no human witnesses to contradict his story. The princess would be stripped of her title, or worse, she could be arrested and imprisoned. Maria walked away from the observation window and moved through the corridors of the settlement. Her colleagues were too busy to notice her behavior. They were all focused on their own survival, their own need to leave this world and return to Earth. She made her way to the secure communications room and locked the door behind her. Using the private encryption codes that she had developed during her time on Zephyra, she sent a message to Xenia. The message was simple and direct. She told the princess that she was not leaving. She told her that she had made a decision to stay behind and help her find a way to safety. The response came within minutes. Xenia's message was written in a mix of Valian and English, the two languages flowing together in a way that only someone who knew both of them could understand. She wrote that Maria was crazy. She wrote that Maria would be throwing away her life, her career, and her future. She wrote all the logical reasons why this was a terrible idea. But at the end of the message, there was another sentence that said everything. It said, "Thank you for not leaving me alone." Maria looked at those 8 words on the screen for a long time. She thought about her duty to the human military. She thought about her responsibility to her fellow soldiers and officers. She thought about her home on Earth and all the people she had left behind. But when she looked at Xenia's words, she knew what she had to do. Some things were more important than following orders. Some bonds were stronger than the chains of duty. She began to prepare for what would probably be the most important night of her life. She downloaded maps of the underground tunnels that connected different regions of Zephyrah. She gathered supplies that could sustain both human and Valian physiology, including food, water purification tablets, and medical kits. She took communication devices that could not be tracked by the official military systems. She moved slowly and carefully, making sure that no one noticed what she was doing. Her fellow officers were too busy with their own evacuation procedures to pay attention to one lieutenant gathering unusual items. As the hours ticked away toward the evacuation deadline, Maria felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. She had made her choice and there was no turning back now. She would either succeed in helping Xenia escape, or she would fail and face whatever consequences came with that failure. Either way, she was committed to this path. The uncertainty of the future did not frighten her as much as she thought it would. Instead, it filled her with a sense of purpose that she had never felt before. When the final shuttle was being prepared for launch, and her name was called over the settlement speakers, Maria did not respond. She had already disabled her tracking device and removed her identification badge from the security system. She was no longer Lieutenant Maria Hayes of the human military. She was simply Maria, a woman who had decided that loyalty to a friend was worth more than loyalty to an institution. As she watched the shuttle lift off into the violet sky carrying the last of the human presence, she turned away from the window and began walking toward the royal palace. It was time to find Xenia and discover what fate had in store for them both. The royal palace of Zephyrah was a structure that seemed to exist somewhere between architecture and art. Its walls were made of crystalline material that refracted light into beautiful patterns of color. The tower spiraled upward like frozen flames, and the gardens surrounding it bloomed with flowers that emitted their own soft luminescence. Maria had walked these grounds many times during her official diplomatic visits, but never like this. Never as a fugitive from her own military. Never with the knowledge that she was about to throw her entire life away. She moved through the shadows, keeping to the less populated areas of the palace grounds. It was late in the evening cycle, but Valian security was still active and vigilant. She had memorized the patrol patterns during her time on Zephyrah, and she used this knowledge to slip past the guards without being detected. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she approached the private entrance to the royal quarters. This was the most dangerous part of the plan. If she was caught here, there would be no excuse she could give. No story she could tell to explain her presence. She tapped on the crystal wall 3 times, then 2 more times. It was a signal she and Xenia had developed for emergency situations. For a moment, nothing happened. Maria held her breath, wondering if the princess had received her message, wondering if something had gone wrong. Then a section of the wall shimmered and became transparent from the inside. A door that had been completely invisible suddenly became visible, and it slid open silently. Xenia stood in the doorway, and the sight of her made Maria's breath catch in her throat. The princess was wearing traveling clothes instead of her usual royal garments. Her violet skin was shimmering with stressed patterns, the bioluminescent markings on her body flickering with anxiety. Her eyes, which could change color with her emotions, were currently a deep shade of orange that indicated fear and determination mixed together. She reached out and grabbed Maria's arm, pulling her inside the room and closing the door behind her. The door immediately became invisible again, blending seamlessly into the wall. For a moment, they simply stood there looking at each other. Maria wanted to say something profound or meaningful, but the words stuck in her throat. Xenia solved the problem by pulling her into an embrace. The princess was shorter than Maria by about 6 inches, but her strength was surprising. They held each other for several moments, and Maria felt a wave of relief wash over her. She was no longer alone in this decision. Xenia was with her. They would face whatever came next together. When they finally separated, Xenia led Maria through the private chambers of the royal quarters. The rooms were decorated with objects from across Zephyra's history and art from many different Valian cultures. Xenia explained that she had been packing essential items for the last several hours. She had gathered historical documents that her family wanted to preserve, personal items that could not be replaced, and more practical supplies like clothing and water containers. She had also acquired the coordinates to a hidden settlement in the northern continent, where a community of Valians who opposed Warlord Kess's policies had established a safe haven. It was called Sanctuary, and it was one of the few places on the planet where someone with royal blood who had defied Warlord Kess might be able to find refuge. Maria studied the map that Xenia showed her on a portable data device. The journey would be long and dangerous. They would have to travel through underground tunnels to avoid detection, cross treacherous terrain, and navigate through regions of the planet that were controlled by Warlord Kess's military forces. The path Xenia had chosen was circuitous and complicated, but it was also the least likely route for their pursuers to anticipate. If they moved quickly and carefully, they might actually have a chance of reaching Sanctuary before Warlord Kess realized what had happened. There was a sudden sound of movement outside the chambers, and both women froze. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, and voices spoke in rapid Valian. Maria recognized one of the voices as belonging to Captain Revan, Warlord Kess's personal security chief. They were discussing the evacuation of humans and expressing satisfaction that the species would soon be completely gone from their world. The voices grew louder for a moment, then gradually faded as the patrol moved past the royal chambers. Maria and Xenia waited for several minutes after the sounds had completely disappeared before they dared to move again. Their plan had always known that time was critical, but hearing the warlord's soldiers so close to them made it even more urgent. They needed to leave the palace immediately. The longer they stayed, the greater the risk of discovery. Xenia led Maria through a series of corridors that the tourist guides never showed to visitors. These were the secret passages that had been built into the palace centuries ago, designed for exactly this kind of situation. Rulers on Zephyra had always known that they might need to escape quickly if their position became untenable. The passages were narrow and dimly lit, with walls that were smooth and slick beneath their hands. They moved through darkness, guided only by the soft glow of a light source that Xenia carried. After what felt like hours, but was probably only about 30 minutes, they emerged from the underground passages into the cool night air outside the palace grounds. They were in a section of the city that Maria had never visited before. The buildings here were older and less well-maintained. The streets were narrow and twisted in confusing patterns, perfect for someone who wanted to avoid being seen by security patrols. Xenia led Maria to a hidden location, where she had arranged for transportation. It was a small transport vehicle with an unusual design, modified to blend in with the local vehicles but equipped with special features to help them travel undetected. The vehicle had been hidden in a building that had been abandoned for years. Xenia explained that she had used private funds to acquire it weeks ago, preparing for the possibility that she might need to escape quickly from the capital. They loaded their supplies into the vehicle, and Maria took a moment to look back at the city one last time. The crystal buildings were glowing in the darkness, beautiful and alien and completely foreign. She had spent 3 years on this world, but in that moment, she understood that she would probably never see the city again. If they succeeded in reaching Sanctuary, if they managed to evade Warlord Kess's forces, she would be spending the rest of her life in hiding. She would have to assume a new identity, forget her past, and build an entirely new existence. It was a heavy realization, but it did not make her question her decision. As Xenia started the vehicle and began driving away from the capital, heading toward the outskirts of the city where the underground tunnel entrances were located, Maria settled back into the seat and closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about Commander Blake and the human settlement and all the people who would soon be safely back on Earth. She thought about her past on that distant blue world and the life she had left behind. But mostly she thought about the princess sitting beside her, the alien woman who had become more important to her than anything else in the universe. They were fugitives now, both of them running from authority and danger. But they were together, and that made all the difference in the world. The vehicle rolled through the dark streets, carrying them toward whatever the future held. Behind them, the capital city continued its normal activities, unaware that two of its most significant inhabitants had just begun a journey that would change the course of both human and Valian history. The night was dark and deep, but Maria felt oddly peaceful. She had made her choice, and now she would live with the consequences. The underground tunnels stretched beneath Zephyra like the arteries of some vast organism. They had been carved out over thousands of years, used by ancient Valians for transportation and shelter during the harsh surface storms that sometimes swept across the planet. The tunnels glowed with bioluminescent organisms that had adapted to the darkness over millennia, creating a soft blue-green light that was just bright enough to navigate by. Maria and Zinnia had abandoned the vehicle at the entrance and were now traveling on foot through these mysterious passages. The air in the tunnels was cool and slightly damp, carrying the scent of minerals and ancient stone. Their footsteps echoed off the walls as they walked, and Maria found herself constantly checking over her shoulder, worried that every sound might be a pursuer. Xenia seemed more relaxed in this environment, even though she was clearly exhausted. She explained that her family had access to many of the tunnel systems, and she had spent her childhood exploring these passages during times when political tensions made it unsafe to be on the surface. They had been walking for approximately 4 hours when they heard the first sounds of pursuit. It was a distant rumbling, barely perceptible at first, but it grew gradually louder as they continued forward. Xenia grabbed Maria's arm and pulled her toward a narrow side passage that branched off from the main tunnel. They crouched in the darkness as a military transport vehicle passed through the main tunnel, its headlights cutting through the darkness like laser beams. Inside the vehicle, Maria could see the silhouettes of Valian soldiers. Warlord Kess's forces had discovered that they had escaped. After the vehicle passed, they remained motionless for several more minutes, making sure that there were no additional patrols coming behind it. Maria's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. This was real. This was actually happening. They were being hunted by an alien military force, and they had nowhere to run but deeper into the dark tunnels beneath the planet's surface. Zinnia whispered that they needed to change their route. The main tunnel system was compromised. They would have to take a more difficult path through the secondary passages. Tunnels that were narrower and more complex, used less frequently and therefore less likely to have military patrols. Maria agreed, though the thought of navigating through even more confusing passages filled her with anxiety. But there was no choice. They had to keep moving. The secondary passages were indeed more difficult to navigate. They were sometimes so narrow that both women had to squeeze through sideways. In some places, the ceiling hung so low that they had to crawl on their hands and knees. The bioluminescent organisms became scarcer, making it harder to see. They had to use the portable light source that Zinnia carried, but they kept it on the lowest setting to minimize the chance of being spotted by patrols. Hours passed in a blur of movement and fear. Maria lost track of time in the darkness. She focused only on the next step, the next breath, the need to keep going. Xenia's strength seemed to fade as they went deeper into the tunnels. Her breathing became more labored, and she stumbled several times. Maria realized that despite her royal training, the princess had probably never done anything like this before. She had always been protected, always had people taking care of her needs. Now she was discovering depths of strength and determination that she did not know she possessed. They finally stopped when they came to a large chamber inside the tunnel system. The chamber was vast, with walls that seemed to soar up into darkness. Bioluminescent organisms covered the ceiling, creating a glow that was almost like starlight. In the center of the chamber was a pool of crystal-clear water, so transparent that it seemed like they could see forever down into its depths. The sight of it made Zinnia visibly relax. She explained that this was the water house, a place where ancient Valians used to gather for ceremonies and important councils. It was a safe place, a neutral ground that held spiritual significance for their people. Military forces would never violate the sanctity of such a location. They sat down by the edge of the pool, and for the first time since leaving the capital, they allowed themselves to rest. Xenia pulled out some of the food she had packed, and they ate in silence, both of them too exhausted to make conversation. Maria looked at the princess and felt a mixture of emotions she could not name. Xenia looked small and vulnerable in the soft light of the chamber. Her violet skin was covered in dust from the tunnels and her hair was tangled and matted. She looked nothing like the polished royal princess that Maria had known at the diplomatic events. Yet at this moment she seemed more beautiful to Maria than she had ever been before. Xenia caught her looking and reached over to take her hand. She said something in Valian, words that Maria did not fully understand but that she knew meant something close to thank you or I trust you or both of those things combined. Maria squeezed her hand in response. They sat like that for a long time, two beings from different species, sitting in a chamber that had stood for thousands of years, finding comfort in each other's presence. The moment of peace was interrupted by a sound echoing through the chamber. It was a voice speaking through some kind of amplification system. The voice was deep and resonant, and it spoke in Valian. Xenia's entire body went rigid. She whispered to Maria that it was Warlord Kess himself. He was broadcasting a message through the tunnel system, trying to reach them. The message was directed at Xenia, telling her that she was a traitor to her people, that she had betrayed everything her family stood for by aligning herself with a human. He said that if she returned to the capital voluntarily, he would show mercy and allow her to live in exile rather than executing her. Xenia looked at Maria with eyes that were now colored a deep red, indicating anger and defiance. She stood up and walked to the center of the chamber. In a voice that was surprisingly strong and clear, she responded to Warlord Kess's message. She told him that she was no traitor. She said that loyalty to a friend was the highest value that any Valian could aspire to. She declared that she would never return to his rule, that she would spend her entire life in hiding if necessary, rather than abandon her principles. The sound of her voice reverberated through the chamber and echoed back through the tunnels, carrying her message to whoever was listening. For a moment, there was silence. Then Warlord Kess's voice came again, but this time it was filled with fury. He declared that Xenia was now officially stripped of her royal title and banished from the kingdom. He announced a reward for anyone who captured her alive or brought him proof of her death. He said that she and her human companion would be hunted to the ends of Zephyra and beyond if necessary. When the broadcast ended, Xenia turned to look at Maria. Her expression was calm but sad. She had just lost her title, her position, her entire world. But when she spoke, her voice was steady. She said that there was no turning back now. They had to reach Sanctuary and they had to survive. They had to prove that Warlord Kess was wrong about them, about humanity, about the possibility of friendship between species. It was a heavy burden, but both women were willing to carry it. The exit from the underground tunnel system opened into a landscape that seemed to belong to another world entirely. The rock formations jutted up from the ground like the teeth of some ancient beast, and between them grew forests of crystalline plants that reflected light in ways that made it difficult to see clearly. The sky above was an unusual shade of amber, and strange clouds drifted across it with no apparent wind to move them. This was the borderland region, the area between the populated regions of Zephyra and the deep wilderness where few Valians ever ventured. Maria and Xenia emerged from the tunnel entrance as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. They had traveled through the tunnels for almost a full day, stopping only briefly for rest and food. The announcement of Xenia's banishment had energized them with a sense of urgency. There was no longer any possibility of compromise or negotiation. They were fully committed to reaching Sanctuary or dying in the attempt. The terrain outside the tunnels was treacherous and difficult to navigate. The crystalline plants cut at their skin if they moved too quickly or carelessly, drawing small amounts of blood. The ground was uneven, full of hidden crevices and sudden drop-offs. Maria found herself constantly catching Xenia when she stumbled, and the princess did the same for her. They worked together as a team, each one watching out for the other, communicating through small gestures and whispered warnings. They had been traveling through the borderland for approximately 12 hours when they spotted the first sign of pursuit. It was a military shuttle descending from the sky in the distance, heading toward the area where they had exited the tunnels. Warlord Kess was taking their escape seriously. He was committing significant resources to capturing them. Maria and Xenia immediately moved off the main path, seeking shelter in a dense grove of the crystalline plants. They crouched behind the largest formations, trying to make themselves as invisible as possible. The shuttle passed over their location and continued toward the tunnel entrance. From their hiding place, Maria and Xenia could see figures descending from the shuttle on rappelling lines. They were Valian soldiers, equipped with advanced weapons and scanning equipment. The soldiers spread out in a search pattern, obviously trying to track which direction Maria and Xenia had gone. It was only a matter of time before they picked up the trail. Xenia tugged on Maria's sleeve and pointed toward a series of rock formations that rose up in the distance. She explained in whispered Valian that the formations concealed a canyon system that was unknown to most people. Her family had discovered it during an archaeological expedition years ago, and it was not recorded on any official maps. If they could reach the canyon before the soldiers tracked them down, they could lose their pursuers in the maze of passages and tunnels that ran through it. They moved carefully away from their hiding place, staying low and moving quickly without making unnecessary noise. Behind them, they could hear the soldiers calling to each other as they searched the area. The sound of their pursuit grew closer, but Maria and Xenia pushed themselves harder, driven by fear and adrenaline. The crystalline plants cut deeper into their skin, drawing blood that left a faint trail behind them, but they could not stop to worry about that now. Survival was all that mattered. They reached the rock formations and began climbing. The stones were rough and sharp, providing good handholds but also cutting into their hands as they pulled themselves upward. Maria's legs burned with effort and her lungs felt like they were on fire from the exertion. Xenia was struggling even more, but she did not complain or ask to stop. Her determination matched Maria's own. The shout came just as they crested the top of the formation. A soldier had spotted them against the amber sky. The sound of weapons charging echoed across the borderland. Maria grabbed Xenia's hand and they descended as quickly as they safely could on the other side of the formation. Behind them, laser blasts seared past their heads, leaving trails of superheated air. They could feel the heat from the weapons against their skin. They reached the edge of the canyon just as the soldiers reached the top of the formation behind them. For a moment, there was a terrible pause. The canyon stretched down before them, a vast chasm that seemed to descend forever into darkness. One wrong step meant death, but staying where they were meant capture or worse. Maria did not hesitate. She pulled Xenia with her as she jumped off the cliff edge. They fell through the air for what felt like an eternity. Maria had time to think about how strange it was to die like this on an alien world, in the arms of an alien princess. But then they struck something that broke their fall. It was a ledge jutting out from the canyon wall, partially hidden by an overhang of rock. They crashed onto it hard, the impact driving the air from their lungs. Maria landed on top of Xenia, trying to protect the princess with her own body. They lay there gasping for breath, stunned and aching but alive. Above them on the cliff edge, the soldiers were looking down into the canyon. They seemed uncertain whether to attempt the jump themselves or whether to search for another route down. The soldiers conferred with each other through communication devices. Minutes passed. Then, to Maria and Xenia's relief, the soldiers turned away from the cliff edge. They were going to search for another path, which meant they would waste valuable time. It was not safety, but it was a reprieve. Maria and Xenia remained on the ledge until they heard the sound of the shuttle taking off. The soldiers had decided to regroup and search from a different location. When the sound faded away completely, Maria helped Xenia to her feet. Both of them were bleeding from multiple cuts and bruises. Xenia's breathing was labored and she was clearly in pain. But when Maria asked if she could continue, the princess nodded without hesitation. They descended deeper into the canyon, moving carefully along narrow ledges and through passages that seemed to have been carved by water erosion over millions of years. The canyon walls were covered with ancient symbols, markings made by Valians from ages past. Xenia explained that these were sacred writings, records of spiritual journeys and important events in Valian history. They were walking through a museum of her people's past, and somehow that seemed fitting given everything that was happening. As they moved deeper into the canyon, the air grew cooler and damper. They could hear the sound of running water in the distance. The canyon opened up into a valley where a river flowed through the landscape, and strange plants grew along its banks. It was beautiful and isolated and exactly what they needed. They had lost their pursuers, at least for now. But Maria knew that this was far from over. Warlord Kess would not stop hunting them. They still had many leagues to travel before they could reach Sanctuary, and every moment of their journey was filled with danger and uncertainty. The river valley became their refuge for the next 3 days. They moved along the banks of the river, following the water downstream toward the northern continent where Sanctuary was located. The valley was isolated and wild, untouched by Valian civilization. Strange creatures moved through the vegetation at night, creatures that Maria had never seen before in all her years on Zephyra. Some of them were curious about the two travelers, but most seemed content to ignore them and go about their own business. They found a cave system near the river, a place where fresh water was available, and where they could shelter from the harsh sun during the hottest parts of the day cycle. Maria hunted small animals using the crude weapon she had fashioned from branches and stones, and Zinnia gathered edible plants that she recognized from her knowledge of Valian flora. They worked together without much conversation, each of them lost in their own thoughts about what had happened and what might happen next. On the evening of the third day, they were sitting by a fire, eating a meal of roasted meat and strange vegetables that Zinnia said tasted like a combination of squash and cinnamon. Maria noticed that Zinnia's bioluminescent patterns had become noticeably dimmer than they had been when they first started their journey. She asked the princess if she was feeling all right. Zinnia hesitated for a moment before answering. She explained that her bioluminescence was connected to her emotional state and her physical health. The stress of their escape and the lack of proper Valian medicine was causing her body to weaken. Maria felt a surge of worry and concern. She asked what they could do to help Zinnia recover. The princess told her that there was a specific mineral compound that grew in certain caves in the northern region, about one more day's journey from where they were currently located. If they could reach those caves and collect the mineral, she could prepare a medicine that would restore her strength. It was a risk because the caves were in an area that was relatively close to one of Warlord Kess's military outposts, but it was a necessary risk if Zinnia was going to survive the rest of the journey. The next morning, they broke camp and began moving north again, following the river as it carved its way through the landscape. The terrain became more challenging as they traveled. The river began to flow more rapidly, moving through a series of gorges and rapids that made it difficult to follow along the banks. They were forced to abandon the relative safety of the river valley and climb into the highlands above it. The air became thinner as they climbed higher, and both women found themselves breathing heavily with the exertion. By midday, they could see the caves that Zinnia had described. They were carved into the side of a large mountain, dark openings that seemed to lead deep into the earth. Surrounding the caves was a landscape of unusual rock formations and mineral deposits that glowed faintly in the sunlight. Zinnia explained that the minerals she needed would be found deep within one of the caves, in a crystalline chamber that contained the specific compound. She would need to go alone into the caves to retrieve it, while Maria remained behind to watch for any signs of pursuit. Maria did not like the idea of separating, but she understood that Zinnia was right. Maria's presence would slow them down, and if soldiers arrived while Zinnia was inside the cave, Maria might be able to distract them or create a diversion to give the princess time to escape. It made logical sense, but emotionally, Maria hated the thought of being separated from Zinnia, even for a short time. They had become so dependent on each other over the last few days that the idea of being apart filled her with a sense of panic. They agreed that Zinnia would have exactly 3 hours to retrieve the mineral and return. If she was not back by then, Maria would assume that something had gone wrong and would wait for 1 more hour before attempting to find her. If Zinnia still had not returned after that additional hour, Maria would have to make the difficult decision to leave and try to reach Sanctuary alone to get help. Neither of them wanted to think about what that scenario would mean for Zinnia, but they both knew it was a possibility. Zinnia disappeared into the cave system, and Maria was left alone on the mountain, watching the landscape and listening for any sounds that might indicate danger. She paced nervously, unable to sit still. She thought about Earth and the life she had left behind. She thought about Commander Blake and her fellow soldiers who were probably already back on Earth by now, settling back into their normal routines, forgetting about the people they had left behind on Zephyra. She thought about her family, if any of them were still alive. She had not heard from them in years. An hour and a half passed without incident. Maria began to relax slightly, starting to believe that they might actually make it through this. But then she heard the sound of military vehicles approaching from the direction of the highlands. Her heart sank. Soldiers were coming toward their location. She checked her timepiece and saw that Zinnia had been in the caves for approximately 2 hours. She still needed at least another 30 minutes to make it back. Maria made a decision. She gathered up their supplies and moved away from the cave entrance, positioning herself on a higher vantage point where she could see the approaching soldiers but where they would have difficulty seeing her. She watched as a military patrol vehicle came into view, and several Valian soldiers emerged from it. They seemed to be conducting a routine patrol of the area, not specifically searching for anyone. But their presence was still dangerous because they might stumble upon the cave entrance and investigate it. The soldiers moved in Maria's direction, spreading out in a search pattern. She was about to reveal herself to create a distraction when another sound caught everyone's attention. It was the sound of an energy explosion coming from deep within the cave system. The soldiers immediately turned their attention toward the caves, drawing their weapons and moving cautiously in that direction. Maria realized that something had gone wrong. Xenia must have triggered some kind of trap or alarm system inside the caves. Maria made a split-second decision. She could not let the soldiers enter the cave and potentially capture Xenia. She gathered a handful of rocks and threw them in the opposite direction from the cave entrance, creating noise and movement that drew the soldiers' attention away from the caves. She shouted in Valian, a phrase that Xenia had taught her, identifying herself as a human and declaring that she was armed and dangerous. It was a bluff because she had no real weapons, but it worked. The soldiers immediately turned their focus toward Maria, weapons raised and ready. In that moment, Xenia burst from the cave entrance behind them, clutching something that was glowing with an internal light. She shouted a warning to Maria, and the princess used her knowledge of the terrain to lead the soldiers on a chase away from their actual location. Maria ran in the opposite direction, using the chaos and confusion to escape. She ran for several minutes before she heard Xenia calling to her from behind a rock formation. The princess emerged, breathless and disheveled, still holding the glowing mineral compound. They looked at each other for only a moment before continuing to run, both of them knowing that they needed to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the soldiers. As they ran across the mountain landscape, toward the north and toward Sanctuary, Maria felt something shift inside her. The fear was still there, and the uncertainty about whether they would survive was still real. But something else was growing stronger. A sense of determination, a belief that somehow against all odds they would make it. They would reach Sanctuary. They would find safety, and when they did, their story would become a legend, a tale of two beings from different worlds who had defied an empire to preserve their friendship. The sun was setting behind them as they ran, and ahead lay the vast unexplored wilderness of northern Zephyra, full of danger and possibility and hope.